The Raven Guard are one of the Space Marine chapters available to play in 10th edition Warhammer 40,000. Traditionally, the chapter is focused on stealth operations, approaching their opponents in the cover of darkness before unleashing lightning-quick raids to decapitate enemy formations and disrupt their logistics. The Raven Guard are the masters of stealth and hit-and-run combat. In this video, I will be discussing how to construct a Raven Guard army from their combat patrol all the way up through a Incursion level and Strike Force level games, using their new and unique detachment, the Shadowmark Talon. But first, a little rules overview of the faction. Space Marines are a faction in Warhammer 40k. You choose the Adeptus Astartes faction keyword when constructing an army in order to play them. However, they are unique in that you can also choose a chapter keyword. This restricts use of any units from other chapters that possess a separate chapter keyword from the one you've selected. However, sometimes gives you bonuses and access to additional things like characters and detachments. In this case, Raven Guard have access to several characters, including Caven Shrike and Athan Sean, as well as the Shadowmark Talon detachment. Being a Codex-compliant chapter, meaning one that largely draws its unit selection from the Space Marine Codex proper and doesn't have a separate supplement of additional rules and units that they can use, Raven Guard will also gain a bonus on their army ability. The Space Marine army ability is Oaths of Moment, which allows you to choose an enemy at the start of your turn to gain bonuses against, including reroll hits, and in the case of Codex-compliant chapters like the Raven Guard, +1 to wound, dramatically improving the quality of your attacks against that particular enemy. Now, in the tabletop game, Raven Guard armies typically use this benefit to isolate particular enemies for destruction by fast-moving, aggressive units. While the faction traditionally has a focus on Phobos and infiltration units, lightly armored Space Marines that are adept at operating behind enemy lines. However, on the tabletop, this typically manifests as a focus on faster infantry, especially being things like jump pack infantry that can use deep strike or redeployment effects to move themselves around the table. In some cases, there's also a focus on heavy infantry, things like Terminators and Centurions, but we're going to go ahead and eschew that for the majority of this video because those are less widely used units and not quite as solid of a baseline to build a collection around. Now, speaking of constructing a collection, I always recommend that players begin with the combat patrol for their faction, and Raven Guard have just received a brand new combat patrol. This is a good starting point for the game because it allows you to construct and build an army without having to go through the complex list building process that you would have to go through for larger games, and allows you to learn the ropes of a new faction or the game as a whole more easily. In this case, the Raven Guard combat patrol consists of 10 infiltration or incursor marines. These are Phobos armored Space Marines. You can typically build out 5 of each of these in the normal loadout for the kit. It's a dual build kit, so you can build either infiltrators or incursors with it, and I recommend you get 1 of each. While having multiple of each of these units is valuable in some lists, for the most part, when you are constructing your collection to play into a wider variety of armies, having 1 of each is going to be more useful. The infiltrators, in particular, are good at backline objective holders. They can protect yourself from enemy deep strikers and are fairly resilient, whereas the incursors are more offensive and can support your gun line, which is going to be something very important as we move on to talk about some of the other units that we're including in our larger lists. Now, from there, we also have a jump pack Space Marine captain. This guy's going to be a very, very good, very useful inclusion as we move up to larger game sizes, especially for some of the enhancements that the Shadowmark Talon, the Raven Guard specific detachment, can take, as well as 5 jump pack assault intercessors that he can hang out with. These guys are an incredibly strong utility unit. They even have some very special synergies with Raven Guard in particular, since they have a special leadership bonus from Caven Shrike, one of the Raven Guard specific characters. So we're going to be focusing very heavily on this particular unit as we move up into larger game sizes, as well as an Invictor Tactical Warsuit. Now, the Tactical Warsuit's a bit of an odd one. It's kind of a Dreadnought equivalent. However, it is more stealth-oriented, and there are some benefits for using it alongside the Shadowmark Talon detachment. This is probably the unit that you'll find taking less and less as you expand your collection and have more units available to you. Now, from there, let's talk about an Incursion-style list built out of this combat patrol, which is just about a doubling of the size of the army, and we'll go through the actual list-building procedure for a 40k army. Now, once we play into larger game sizes, we have to select a detachment. In this case, obviously, we are going to be playing with the Shadowmark Talon detachment. That's the specific detachment for Raven Guard. Now, this detachment gives you some bonuses when you are far away from enemies. Your army is stealthy, so it gets the stealth keyword, as well as the benefit of cover, which is essentially +1 to your saving throws if you are more than 12 inches away from your opponent. So, what this allows you to do is you can play a little bit more aggressively with some of your more heavily armored units and play them out in the open, as long as they're far away from the enemy, because they have a greatly enhanced resilience when we compare them to the standard profile. They're -1 to be hit, and in many cases get +1 to they're safe thanks to the benefits of cover. That combos well with units that are either good at operating from a long distance or innately have a strong defensive characteristic. So things like dreadnoughts or armored vehicles actually get a huge benefit from this detachment ability. Now, the detachment also has some incredibly powerful effects for infantry as well. So it's not all just heavy vehicles that want to get these bonuses. The first one that's going to be huge is the enhancement Hunter's Instincts. This allows you to treat the battle round as as a later round when arriving from reserve. Now, this sounds like not a very powerful ability, but what it allows you to do is bring in your reserves in battle round 1, or more importantly, use stratagems like rapid ingress to arrive even earlier than normal from the outset of the game. This is honestly one of the most powerful enhancements in the game, and I will explain exactly why as we go and talk about playing an Incursion army. There are also some other very powerful effects. There are stratagems to buff your attacks if you're far away from your opponent. Again, we're kind of playing into that theme of being stealthy and hiding in the shadows. And we also have a stratagem to return into reserve from the battlefield. Now, as we move on to larger game sizes, we start to include the chapter master, Ethan Sean, in this army. You're going to get the use of this stratagem for free, so it's going to be an important one that we talk about quite a bit. But otherwise, it is generally going to be useful to reposition your infantry units around the table to perform actions, or to get them closer to your opponent. And Raven Guard, being very good at jumping around the table, use a lot of these effects quite a bit. So making the most use out of them and learning when to use these effects that will put your units into reserve and then bring them back on the table from reserve is an important part of playing Raven Guard. Now, with all that discussed, we'll move on to talking about the army as a whole. Now, in this case, we've added essentially 2 units to the list. The first one being a unit of Vanguard veterans. These are jump pack equipped infantry that get some bonuses on the charge. They have a couple of different build options. They come with a stock standard melee weapon. However, you can build them either with pistols, like grav pistols if you want to deal with vehicles, or you can take Infernus pistols to do a little bit more damage, or you can take Storm Shields to give them an invulnerable save. In this case, I'm going to say that basically both of these weapon options are very valid. There are reasons to take both. The Storm Shields are better, I think, for Cave and Shrike's unit specifically, and they make the unit more resilient, but they don't have quite as much damage. I'll talk about some instances in which we want to take the pistol-equipped unit later. However, I will say that basically, as long as you're taking a pretty high damage pistol, you can basically not go wrong with either one of these. We're going to use these guys as kind of an Alpha Strike unit, so it's not super necessary that they are hyper-survivable, because they're ideally not really going to be engaged by your opponent until they're already up in the fight and they've already gotten work done. We've also added a Vindicator in here. I've mentioned before that the detachment has special synergy with armored units. This feels a little idiosyncratic for Raven Guard, and I will say that unfortunately, just the way that Raven Guard tend to be designed, they do have a lot of weird idiosyncrasies. One thing that they tend to do actually on the tabletop is be very good with heavy infantry, things like Gravis and Terminator equipped infantry, but canonically that's not really what they're supposed to be doing. And in this case, we have a Vindicator. This synergizes very well with the detachment ability because he can become even more difficult to kill at a baseline. From there, I always recommend that we attach the Space Marine Captain into one of these units, most likely into the Jump Pack Assault Intercessor unit, but we'll get him his own unit of Vanguard veterans as we increase the size of the army. He's going to improve their strength characteristic, and then we're going to give him the Hunter's Instincts enhancement, which allows you to, again, set up earlier than you normally would. Now, when it comes to playing this army on the table, it's going to play very non-standard compared to a lot of Space Marine armies, which does make sense because Raven Guard are going to play a little bit weird. First of all, we have Cave and Shrike here, who has a couple of effects that are going to be super beneficial for him. The first one is that he grants his unit lone operative, so they can't be attacked from outside 12 inches, which is hugely powerful. He's also a lone operative by himself, so you can't take him on his own if you want to, and he's pretty good at fighting in melee. But the big thing is that you can use this to deploy in such a way that your opponent isn't going to be able to attack you. So you can pre-measure your opponent's threat range when you go to deployment. I would probably save these guys to a later deployment potentially, and then try to see where your opponent can set up their models. You know that a move 12 model, it has to be within 12 inches to attack them, so its total threat range against this unit is 24 inches. If you're outside of that distance, there's no way, unless they have special speed enhancements, there's no way that they can attack Cave and Shrike or his unit. So you can play kind of out in the open, which is why I say before that it's unlikely you're going to get these guys attacked before they're able to come in and attack your opponent. From there, Caven has the Phobos keyword. This is the reason that it's important we keep him in the army, which means we could use the Feint and Thrust stratagem on the unit, which gives them the ability ability to advance and charge. Normally, it would give them the ability to fall back and charge. However, if you use it on a unit with the Phobos keyword, which Caven has, so he grants it to the unit's total combined keywords, they can advance and charge. And also shoot. So if you are equipped with pistols, you can move them up to potentially 18 inches, depending on what we roll on our advance roll. Then shoot with their weapons and then charge into your opponent's deployment zone. So these guys' threat range is super long. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that you charge immediately right as the game begins, but what you can do is if your opponent doesn't give you a very good opportunity, you can stage them into a forward position. So you can sort of start them out wherever. They don't need to hide behind terrain as long as your opponent doesn't have the movement to attack them early. They can run behind a terrain feature like this, and now suddenly the threat range of a move 12 unit with advance and charge is extremely far. On average, somewhere around 23 inches. So you can tell that your opponent now has to consider that this unit of Vanguard veterans could charge essentially anything that's on any three of these objectives at the center of the table, and potentially even units that are on their home objective. So this unit just being here is suddenly threatening so much of this table space. Now, the Vanguard Veterans aren't the hardest hitting unit in the game, but especially at the Incursion level of gameplay, they're going to do enough damage that your opponent really has to consider whether or not they want to go into those positions. So these guys are a very powerful tool for that reason, and their ability to deploy almost anywhere you want without taking up real estate behind line of sight blockers like terrain features or ruins in some terrain layouts can get very difficult because the physical mass of your models start to impede each other, and so you run out of positions where you can stand where your guys can hide. However, these guys being lone operative, they get to ignore that. Now, the other thing that this the army has is a lot of scouting units. We have the Invictor Tactical Warsuit as well as the Incursion unit. Both of them has scout, so both of them want to deploy in a position where they can, on turn one, move up into a safe spot that is, for example, behind this ruin terrain, behind this terrain feature, behind this wall, and in a position where they can threaten these objectives. Now, both of these units also have the Phobos keyword, so they're also able to feint and thrust. So our Invictor Tactical Warsuit, which we can equip with probably an Incendium cannon, which is a big flamethrower. We can also equip him with some longer range guns if we feel that you are lacking in long range punch, but that allows him to advance, shoot, and charge. He's able to use his relatively fast movement characteristic to get up the table, shoot your opponent down, and then charge into them early. So if your opponent has units that are sort of out in the open, what you can do is use the Invictor Tactical Warsuit to sort of begin the fight. Because he has scout and because he has the ability to advance and shoot with that stratagem, he can move 8 inches at this beginning of the game. He can then move 8 inches during his movement phase. He can then advance an average of additional 3 inches, and then he can charge an average of 7 inches. So you can see that this guy has the ability to really just ram into your opponent from turn one. Otherwise, he can also, if you have a position where he can hold an objective down and force your opponent out into your own threat range, he can also do that. He can just scout up behind this line of sight blocker, take some board space, take some real estate, and then run onto an objective to just grab it. But if your opponent has something that he's capable of killing, you can just ram him in turn one and immediately alpha strike your opponent right off the table with that long scout move plus advance and charge. So always be considering that. And don't forget as well that he's going to get +1 to wound and he's going to get hit rerolls against an Oath of Moment target. And the same goes for the Vanguard veterans over here. So while their base stats don't look that impressive, if this guy's running up, shooting all his guns, and then charging you, all of them have +1 to wound and all of them have hit rerolls, the chances that he kills a full unit on turn one is relatively high. So especially if it's not like very heavily armored, it's a light vehicle, something like that, he can just kill them right off the bat. So that's something to definitely consider. He's also just a good objective holder. The Incursors you want to play a little bit more cagey with. They're going to be a utility unit, so they're going to be scoring secondary objective cards. They're going to be holding down objectives. They're going to be screening your opponent, playing a little less aggressive. They aren't bad in melee, especially against other light infantry like guardsmen or Tau Fire Warriors or something like that, but they are not particularly strong themselves. But the big thing that they do is they give you +1 to hit units that they shoot with their gun. So what they want to do is kind of combo off with the Vindicator. So these guys can wander out, hide themselves into an aggressive position. You can move the Vindicator into a hidden space. It is difficult to kill at range, but you don't want to give your opponent the first crack at it if you don't have to. But then as soon as something comes out that they can attack, this guy, you could just pop one Incursor out, shoot the enemy with the Incursor, run the Vindicator out, blast the whatever that unit is with the Vindicator. The Vindicator is good into a variety of targets. It has a blast weapon that also does multi-damage, so it's good into heavy targets, and it's good into mass infantry. Especially if you're looking at like 5 infantry, there's a non-zero chance it can kill it. And the benefit of the Incursors here are that you don't necessarily need Oath of Moment to attack with that Vindicator, because he's going to be getting +1 to hit whatever the Incursor's shot. So you can combo them together to allow your other units to benefit from Oath of Moment. We can Oath of Moment something that the Invictor Tactical Warsuit Warsuit is going to be hammering into. We can Oath of Moment something that the Vanguard veterans are going to be hammering into. And all of those are going to be getting the full benefit of that ability while the Vindicator's still shooting with a essentially 2+ ballistic skill, +1 to hit from the Incursors, which is hugely powerful. Now, the last unit we have the Infiltrators back here. I always recommend you keep these guys on a home objective, and they can score some points passively for you. I mean, you might be able to commit them into the fight in the late game, but largely they're going to keep your backfield safe from deep strikers. But the other unit we have in the army is the Assault Intercessor Squad, and I recommend that we attach the captain in with these guys, so he is an attachment. Now, he has Hunter's Instincts as the enhancement in this particular detachment, which allows him to arrive from deep strike early in the game or rapid ingress from turn 1 onwards. Now, with Rites of War, the Space Marine Captain's datasheet ability, you can use a stratagem on them for free once per battle round without having to spend it out of your command point pool. And in this case, it allows you to rapid ingress for free in the first battle round of the game. Now, the goal here is going to be to try to set up a situation. You want to play very cagey, and you want to basically bait your opponent into a big trap. So you can use your forward operators in the early game to set up in a position where you can start to score objectives, right? We're threatening control of a lot of objectives, and we're keeping the rest of our army relatively safe. We'll call this turn 1 of movement. We can reach out and touch a couple of objectives and force our opponent to come forward into the middle of the table. We can then attack with the entire army all at once, right? Cave and Strike's unit can advance and charge, so he can hop right up into an aggressive position. At the end of the first battle round, so at the end of your opponent's movement phase in turn 1, so whether that's they go first or you go first, and it's going to be the bottom of 1 or top of 1, you can use rapid ingress on these guys to put them into another aggressive position. So you can put them in somewhere wherever your opponent isn't threatening your army. So let's say that they have a unit that's holding this objective, and you can just drop these guys right here, 9 inches away. You want them to set up in a position where your opponent can't see them, so you don't get shot. However, what the benefit of rapid ingress is, it allows you to set up on your opponent's turn and then move and act normally on your own turn. So while Cave and Strike is on the table, your opponent always knows where he is, but he can advance and charge, so he can hop up into your opponent's face at any time. These guys can rapid ingress, appear here, then move 12 inches, then charge. So you can see, for example, that if your opponent leaves their deployment zone almost at all, you suddenly have this predominance of units that can all charge the deployment zone all at the same time. You have the Vindicator that can pop out alongside the Incursors, shoot at something, blast it with the Vindicator, and you create this alpha strike where your entire army engaging your opponent all at the same time. And most armies will not be able to withstand that attack and then also counterattack. Now, what I want to make sure that you do is you don't overcommit your units into things they can't necessarily kill. The Vindicator's good at killing enemy armor. If you equip these guys with Inferno pistols and you shoot the Oath of Moment target, they can do some pretty serious damage against armor as well. They're not amazing in combat, but they're good enough so they'll get some work done. These guys are going to hit relatively hard, but they're not going to hit super hard. We're not killing tanks or anything with this unit. We're just going to come in and we're just going to beat up on some infantry, basically. And the same goes for the Invictor Warsuit. He's a pretty strong melee attack, but without Oath of Moment. He's not killing tanks. He's likely not one-shotting any large vehicles by himself. So what you want to do is construct a situation where you can hit your opponent. You're not necessarily going to like immediately break the back of their army right off the bat, but it's unlikely that they'll be able to kill enough of your army on the swing back that you can't then hit them again the subsequent turn with whatever you have remaining and construct a situation where you can win from there. And that's kind of the goal with a lot of these Raven Guard lists. Now, with that in mind, let's move over and talk about some Strike Force games. This is a 2,000-point game mode that is about a doubling of the game size that we played in Incursion. Now, I will mention that for all of the armies that I make on this series, I do leave a little bit of additional room in the points values to allow for some flexibility. So if you want to switch out units for other units that you can, or if you want to add a favorite unit of yours, you can do so. Or if the points values expand with future balance updates. This one has about 100 points left, so we could add an additional squad or swap out a squad for a more effective one or something as we discuss this army. But with that being the case, let's talk about the new things that we added. Now, we added a bunch more additional ranged elements. This is something that I encourage you to do as you are getting used to 40k play, is focusing on more heavily armored units. Gives you a little bit of resilience. These units aren't the easiest thing in the world to kill. There is some synergy, as we mentioned before, with the Shadow Martel and detachment ability to begin with. The other thing is that utilizing things like, in this case, Gladiator Lancers, which have a baked-in reroll thanks to their Aquiline optics, means that they don't necessarily need Oath of Moment in order to be effective. And especially once we consider that we already have our Incursion squad in the army that can give the ranged units +1 to hit, you don't really need much support to run these things. They're not the only vehicle in the faction that works like this. Ballistic Dreadnoughts are another really good one. They have rerolls baked in on their own attacks. Predator Annihilators are something similar. The Ballistic Dreadnoughts particularly good here because they have a baseline 2+ armor save, so they get the benefit of cover really nicely. They're extremely difficult to kill at range in this detachment. But I figured in this case, the Gladiator Lancer, it's more dedicated anti-tank. The army already clears infantry pretty well, so we don't really need the Ballistic Dreadnought that is a little bit more well-rounded than the Lancer, which is very hyper-focused on killing vehicles. And the Lancer is nothing if not a sniper tank, which feels very Raven Guard build. However, you could switch out these Lancers for things like Vindicators, for things like Ballistic Dreadnoughts. All of those armored vehicles are good. But I do encourage you, as you are learning to play the faction and learning to play the game, that you focus on these armored vehicles more so than infantry units. Now, as you learn to play the faction a little bit more, there is a swap you can perform for these armored elements, and that is Centurion infantry. The big benefit here is that you can use Into Darkness stratagem inside the detachment to enter the strategic reserve with these units, which allows you to constantly deploy them around the table. It's probably the most powerful combination in the army, but it is very easy to screw up, and units like Centurions are not something that we are going to use in many other builds outside of this one Shadow Martalon build. So if you're just starting a collection, I would not necessarily recommend that you begin with a unit like a Devastator Centurion squad, despite how effective it is in Shadow Martalon. However, things like Lancers, things like Vindicators, Ballistic Dreadnoughts, they are good in a variety of detachments. If you want to play Ironstorm Spearhead, if you want to play Gladius Task Force, any of these other detachments that you can build your collection into, those are going to be effective, whereas the Devastator Centurion's less so outside of this particular army. Now, that said, we are still going to be using Into Darkness for some benefit here. In this case, we're going to use a big unit of Inceptors. The nice thing about Inceptors is that they have Deep Strike and they have Meteoric Descent, which allows you to Deep Strike 6 inches away from enemies rather than the normal 9 inches. What we can do here is, typically I would recommend you equip Plasma Blasters on these guys rather than the Assault Bolters that they have. However, either one is very effective. You can choose the Oath of Moment target for these guys. You can use Into Darkness to bring them out of reserve, bring them up into reserve. When you have Deep Strike like Inceptors do, and you come in out of strategic reserve, you can use the Deep Strike rules, and you can do this on early as turn 1 if you begin the unit on the table. Then you can put them anywhere you want. If you put them outside of 12 inches of your target, you can give them Stunning Fusillade for +1 ballistic seal and +1 AP. So they hit on 2s, rerolling if you target your Oath of Moment target, +1 to wounds, and they're firing Plasma Blasters. They're winning almost everything in the game on 4s, with rerolls because their weapons are twin-linked, and an additional AP. So they're hitting at AP 4 at that point, which makes this unit capable of basically killing almost anything. Any vehicles or medium to heavy infantry units, they'll just kill. You can run the Assault Bolter versions. They are worse at killing heavy vehicles, but they are better at killing infantry. And you also get a benefit where you can reroll your hit roll to try to get more sustained hits, which is great on the Assault Bolters if you target your Oath of Moment target. So there is some synergy there. If you do want to play the Bolter variety, both varieties of Inceptors are great. I highly recommend you play them in general. And in this case, we're going to take at least one big unit of 6 in order to synergize with that Into Darkness stratagem. Now, the other thing that we've done is we've taken another unit of Vanguard veterans specifically to give to our Space Marine captain. Jump Pack Assault Intercessors, in this case, we're going to use more as scoring units, and they're very good at doing that because they get an additional objective control characteristic bonus thanks to Haven Strike. So they're very good at stealing objectives away from people. But as we move on to larger game sizes, we want a big spooky unit for the Space Marine captain to jump into. He also grants +1 strength to his unit when they charge, so these guys become strength 6, which is a great breakpoint to be for a lot of vehicle profiles that you're attacking. The other thing that he does too is that he allows you to do his rapid ingress shenanigans when you use Hunter's Instincts with them to come in early, and that allows you to move close to enemies where you can use things like Infernus Pistols on them. So you can get shooting damage out of a Vanguard veteran squad if you Oath of Moment your target and you use those Inferno Pistols to get close and you blast away before charging in, which gives these guys a ton of potential damage. Very similar to what we talked about with Cave and Strike. From there, we've also added an additional Intercessor squad. These guys are great for backline objective holding. And as you move on towards the later game, you can use Into Darkness to put them into reserve and then bring them in off a table edge. They can't Deep Strike like the Inceptors can, but they can just be used as a little utility unit that can hop around. So it's just a nice unit to have, especially when you're using that stratagem in particular. Now, when it comes to playing this army on the table, we're going to make a lot of use of reserve mechanics. Obviously, I think that we should always keep the unit of Jump Pack Vanguard Veterans with the Space Marine Captain with Hunter's Instincts in reserve, and the goal is 100% of the time to rapid ingress these guys into your opponent on an early turn, whether that's top or bottom of one, even early turn 2 maybe. Use that stratagem for free with Rights of War, drop them down, and then hammer blow your opponent. You oftentimes want to do that in the same turn that you deliver these guys. These are your Inceptors, and if you can do both of those units at the same time, we can inflict kind of the Alpha Strike that we discussed on our opponent previously. If you do have the CP for it as well, you can also do the thing with the Invictor Tactical Warsuit, where you scout the Warsuit forward at the beginning of the game, you move it forward, and then you try to clear an enemy unit. Then you set up at the same time to bring these guys in and also hit with the Vanguard Veterans, and that is an Alpha Strike that a lot of armies are going to have a tough time sort of easily cleaning up, especially when you're threatening so many ranged attacks from your backline. From there, we can use Cape and Shrike and his long threat range to sort of mop up the rest of the game. I largely recommend that you keep ranged elements in reserve, at least one of them if you have multiples. So having a Gladiator Lancer in strategic reserve to come on off a table edge and shoot at your opponent forces them to screen, and it gives you the opportunity to get some neat angles later on in the game. So I always like to put one of those guys in strategic reserve as well, whereas the other ones can stay on the table and just force your opponent to position around their threat ranges. Now, on top of that, interesting thing is that in order to use Into Darkness to its greatest effect, I always recommend that you keep the Inceptors on the battlefield at the start of the game. And you might think this is weird because there are a deep striking unit that's purpose-built for deep striking, but the reason that we start them on the table is that if you target them with Into Darkness while they're on the battlefield and they have deep strike, they can come in immediately on the subsequent turn. So at the end of your opponent's turn, let's say they go first and they move their army around and they say, oh, I have to worry about this rapid ingress guy. I'm going to screen with a bunch of infantry. I'm going to put a bunch of infantry in the middle of the table, and I'm going to try to prevent that guy from hitting really hard. We can rapid ingress and go kill something with him if we want to, but at the end of the turn, we can pay 1 CP, put them into strategic reserve. They can then use Deep Strike to arrive anywhere 6 inches away from enemies. So we can put them, let's say we put them on a flank position over here. Your opponent's screened out. They have a lot of models in this area to screen out your drops. These guys aren't that worried about screening because they can go near enemies. Then you set them up in a position where they can all get line of sight to one model in your target unit. So let's say there's an enemy screening guy over here. You set them up so they can all see that guy, and then you oath them up with the unit, you blast it away, and suddenly you've been able to, from the very back line of your table edge, basically set these guys up, immediately kill one of your opponent's units, and because you have total control of over where they go, as long as they have line of sight to their target, and as long as you are 6 inches away from all enemies, you can do so in many cases without being able to be attacked back. So what you want to do is get these like really little acute angles where you try to get line of sight with your unit in a position where your opponent's guns aren't going to be in a position to come and counterattack you. And then you can keep doing that and teleporting this unit around the table and constantly blowing up enemies. So the goal, ideally, is to use them to clear out some enemy screens or hit a big spooky target at the same turn that your Vanguard Veteran Squad is charging. So if they can get a bead on a vehicle or monster or a big unit of infantry and they can just clear it out, these guys charge something else and you've Alpha Strike your opponent for 2 units. And then we oftentimes do what's called threat overloading. We'll put a bunch of units up in the middle of the table. You'll throw up things like the Vindicator. You'll throw up things like your infiltration units, and they can go and threaten control of objectives while your opponent's dealing with these units. They have to kill these units, which will take most of their army, typically, depending on the board state and what faction you're playing, and then you can counterattack with Cave and Shrike and while your guns, and you can sort of like finish them off from there. You're not going to Alpha Strike your opponent into oblivion on a 2,000 point game, but you're going to do enough damage and force them to play so cagey with your deep strikes and things that they won't be able to come back and interact with you on the table in the future. Now, because we have these intercessors, we don't necessarily need the infiltration unit to stand on the back objective. If your opponent has deep strikers or reposition effects, I would encourage these guys to go protect your back objectives and protect your deployment zone from being deep struck on. But if they don't, the intercessors can just lock the objective under your control, and then they can just leave. They can just run away and go do something else. Worst case scenario, I would always start the intercessors on this objective to lock it in, and then just put the infiltrators in such a position where you can screen out enemies from being able to drop on that objective because they have an anti-deep strike aura. You screen 12 inches rather than 9, so they're good for protecting your backline from people coming in and trying to get to your utility units or trying to get to your ranged attackers. If you don't need that, however, you can drop them off in the middle of the table because they have infiltrate, and they can go somewhere, let's say like behind this line of sight blocker, where they can get to this objective very easily to do actions on it or score secondaries, but your opponent doesn't have line of sight to them. That's a great spot for those guys. Now, the jump pack intercessors are also a really important unit in this particular list. Because you have Cave and Shrike in the army, they become OC2, so they're twice as good at stealing objectives away from enemies. And what you want to do is ideally set them up in positions, and you can also do this with Deep Strike and Threat and Rapid Ingress as well, like we talked about with the Vanguard veterans. They can't do that on turn 1, but they could do it on turn 2 onwards. You want to set them up in positions where they have good charges onto the objectives that your opponent is threatening to control. If you do that, they're very good, almost purpose-built for killing lighter infantry, so toughness 3 infantry, stuff like that. These guys can come in and they can just wipe that unit out and put 10 objective control on the objective to steal it away from your opponent. We call these disruption pieces or disrupting units because they disrupt your opponent's control over their objectives, and they disrupt their ability to consistently score. That's what these guys are good for. They're also good for scoring secondary objectives, so running up and doing actions and things like that if you need to in a pinch. However, the big benefit that you get is access to these OC2 really fast melee units that can run in, charge, engage your opponent, and just be generally a nuisance while being very high OC on objectives. So that's why we're including 2 units of those guys. You might even want to take a third as well if you want to spend the additional points that I have floating in this particular build. So you could have more of those guys if you want to, in order to disrupt your opponent's control of objective. Now, this style of gameplay is very aggressive. You will suffer many casualties. A lot of times you're trading your Space Marines away for board presence. Basically, this Hunter's Instinct Captain, you always assume that he's going to die as soon as he commits. Cave and Strike's unit's going to be very similar. You want him to ideally commit in a position where your opponent's going to be, like, their back is going to be broken on the second round of charging. But sometimes you lose him as well. You'll lose your Inceptors as soon as they show up. And then these units will usually trade for objective control. That leaves you with the shooting base of Lancers and the Vindicator, and that's what you kind of need to win the game with. So even if all your Vanguard veterans die and stuff like that, as long as they got value, and especially if they've altered the tempo of the game, so you played aggressive enough that your opponent can't really leave their deployment zone very well because you have so many Deep Strikers, or you have so many Rapid Ingressing units, or you're just charging them inside their own deployment zone. The Victor Tactical Warsuit also helps with this too, because your opponent has to respect its threat range, so they have to play farther back. Then all your little units can just hold the objectives in the middle, and you can win on score. Oftentimes with Raven Guard, especially a list like this, you're going to be low on attrition, so you're going to trade your units away for tempo, essentially. And your opponent's going to kill them. However, you're going to rack up points, and you're going to be able to win towards the end of the game. And that's a lot of times where Raven Guard does win. However, obviously, you do have these armored vehicles in the back line. They do get the benefits from being far away from your opponent. And you have both the moment, so they can do some serious damage shooting by themselves. So even if your infantry is all dead, it's not like these guys can't close out the game by themselves. The armored vehicles are going to be very powerful. But with that, that is a guide on getting started with Raven Guard in 10th edition Warhammer 40k with their unique detachment. From here, there's a bunch of different ways you can go. As I mentioned before, you can further optimize this particular build of the list. It tends to play, if you play like the more competitive varieties, it tends to focus a lot on Centurions and heavy infantry, Inceptors, things like that. I did not go that direction because I think in a lot of cases, if you are building this list out into other varieties, you're not going to be using those units, and those are kind of expensive units, and it takes a very unique build to like hyper optimize the Shadowmark Talon. But this army gives you a good opportunity to get started with a lot of other detachments. You can play things like Ironstorm Spearhead. We have a lot of these individual characters and individual vehicles that are great in that detachment. Gladius Task Force is phenomenal with all of these units. That's another big one. You can even play things like Stormlands Task Force, which has, or I would say, I don't know about good, but it has solid synergy with things like Vanguard veterans. It loves having fast units in play. Now, on top of that, there's also some additional characters we didn't talk about in Raven Guard. Aeth and Sean, the Chapter Master, is another one. I specifically didn't include him in here because he's very complex as a character to play. He's a single entity unit, so he operates by himself. He's a lone operative. So he's good for scoring, and he gives you a lot of command point efficiency inside the Shadowmark Talon detachment because he gives you use of Into Darkness for free. However, he also has a non-optional second ability that can mess up your charging. It's actually kind of a downside on his data sheet. It gives you reroll charges against a specific target, but forces everything that charges within 12 inches of that target to charge it. So every time you declare a charged target, if Aeth and Sean's abilities target is a possible target for that charge, you must target it, and in some cases, they can really mess up your game plan if you don't think very heavily about how to use it. Now, obviously, he's a solid character besides that, but I would caution a new player who's just getting into the faction that he's very complex, and in some cases, you can actually ruin your own game plan by misusing his abilities. So it's something to keep in mind. Otherwise, definitely play this guy. He's great. He has a good profile. He's fast. He's good at scoring. He's just generally a solid guy to have. But from there, the grimdark universe of Warhammer 40,000 is basically your oyster. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about these armies. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise and lets me make all these videos, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, or Twitch subscribers. You can join in the links down below the video. I really appreciate you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.